こんにちは。私の名前はHakonです。今日は日本語の文字についてお話しします。Hello, my name is Hakon, and today I'm going to talk about Japanese characters. One thing one has to or should get to grips with when learning Japanese is, of course, to read and to write. Something that makes Japanese a little bit complicated and sometimes also a little bit simpler is the way it is written. Now, Japanese didn't used to have its own writing system. Indeed, it borrowed it, stole it, took it, acquired it. Well, they took the Chinese one and turned it into Japanese. Now, you look at the characters and you might think that quite reasonably so that Japanese and Chinese are related languages. And indeed, many of the words in Japanese are Chinese loan words as well. It's quite a big part of the vocabulary, but they are linguistically completely unrelated. So the only reason you have that connection between Japanese and Chinese is that they are neighboring countries, and at some point, Japanese not having its own writing system, they used Chinese to write. So first of all, there was also quite a big. We're talking about probably about 1,000 years ago. Um, a lot of official documents and writings in Japan would be done in Chinese. It was considered a more proper language for administration, a bit like how Latin has been used in parts of history of Europe. And also, Chinese culture was looked up to in Japan. Chinese poetry, for instance, Chinese writings on different things, writings on Taoism, of course. Taoism, quite a big influence on Japanese culture, on Zen Buddhism, etc. So, Chinese characters were then used in Japanese. And but two different things happen because the Chinese characters originally are ideograms. So a character has is actually a kind of symbolic or actual representation of a thing or an abstract concept. Usually it starts with a thing and the abstract concepts are derived from them. So if you have something very simple, like I'll just do a very simple, some simple ones now. So we have this character here, which means human being. So you can sort of see there are two legs, and of course it's been simplified over time. You can imagine that it started almost like a sort of a stick figure at some point, and it just got simplified over time. Other ones that might be easy to see, that's a mountain there. Of course, you can imagine that it might have started like something like this. River, which you can also imagine it started with something a little bit more river-like, something like that. The sun, of course, like this. And of course, in most pictograms everywhere in the world, the sun is depicted like that. So you can sort of see it became more angular and more stylized over time. And these had sort of a literal meaning. Now, what happened in Chinese and indeed also in Japanese is that many of these characters would have been started to be used not for their meaning but for their sound. So if you imagine that you have a word for which there is no character, but it has the same sound as the character for sun, for instance. And then you would use that character to represent the sound and not just the meaning of sun in a word. And this happened in both Chinese and in Japanese. But while it still is like that in Chinese, in Japanese, they've moved away from doing that. And this is one of the ways that Japanese actually becomes easier to read as well. Because they replaced the phonetic characters when the character is only used phonetically rather than for meaning. in almost all cases, were replaced with simpler characters. And I'll just show you a page now of writing, just to pick one at random here for one of my storybooks. So if you look at this page here, you might be able to spot there are different kinds of characters. There are these more complex ones, and they also very often have this little character next to them, which is a way to show the pronunciation, because that will vary, and we'll get back to that. So these are the original Chinese characters. Sometimes they've changed a little bit. I mean, both Chinese and Japanese have had, well, spelling reforms, I suppose we can call them, where the characters have been changed, very usually simplified. And so these characters are the Chinese characters. And then we have these simpler, slightly sort of rounded characters. You can almost see it's almost like it's derived from a kind of handwriting, a more sort of cursive, flowy writing. Of course, they were writing with brushes, where the lines, the sort of different lines of the more stylized characters are just merged together and they're simplified. And these are the ones that in Japanese are used for writing phonetically. So syllables that are used for grammatical endings, for particles, and I'll get to back to what particles are at some point as well. And for lots of words, also are parts of words where you have something that is used as a sort of a meaning word, a meaning character, and then you have part of the word is written with these other characters. And that is one of the syllabary systems used in Japanese, and it's known as hiragana. I'll just write that out now. Hiragana. It's this is like my blackboard, actually. It's a whiteboard. Hiragana. So that is what it's called. The original Chinese characters, I've mentioned that before, they are known as kanji, which of course means Han character. And I think the last part of hiragana, I think that also means sort of character as well. Now, there is a third system as well, and if you look at this page again, you can see there are some characters that are simplified, but they're quite angular. So you can almost imagine there are, if you take the stylized Chinese characters, the kanji as we will call them from now on, and you take parts of them that represent the sound that you use as a phonetic spelling, and you turn that into a writing system, you get these angular characters. And that is the third system. It is known as Katakana. I'll just write that down as well. So hang on, there's room here. Katakana. And while historically, actually, katakana was used to what hiragana is used for today, but these days it is common to write Japanese words and grammatical endings, etc., in hiragana, whereas if you have loan words that are not from Chinese, and I'll get back to that, in Japanese, you write them in katakana. Also, you can imagine that if you have something that is a little bit like how we use italics in writing, when we write English, something to sort of show emphasis, you might also use katakana. It is also common practice to write business names in katakana. Sometimes you see film titles as well. But business names, if you see a restaurant or a sort of sign on the street in Japan, very often you would see katakana for some of the signs. So those are the three ones: kanji, Chinese characters, Han characters; hiragana, more sort of cursive, flowy characters; katakana, simplified kanji, angular characters. And those are the three systems of writing. Now, there's another little interesting thing about this, is that I did mention it, loan words from Chinese. Now, Even though Chinese and Japanese are unrelated languages, you have a huge overlap of vocabulary, and that's because so many loanwords came from Chinese into Japanese. And these loanwords are always written with kanji. But these kanji, like for instance, now you have this one here, which means mountain. Just circle that one. And of course, you might have a loaned word from Chinese that included the word mountain. Let's imagine that for a moment. But at the same time, we would also have the word meaning mountain in Japanese, and it would be something else. And so you get something that happens in Japanese that is a little bit tricky to get to grips with, and that is how each of these Chinese characters, the kanji, how they can have different pronunciations depending on what word they're in. If the word is of Chinese origin, they would have one pronunciation that is based on the Chinese pronunciation. If they are in words of Japanese origin, they would have a different pronunciation based on what that was called in Japanese before the Chinese influence. And in many cases, there are two readings for each of the characters, but sometimes there are more as well. And although most of the time, in those cases, it's sort of phonetic variations as well. You might imagine something pronounced as bin might also be pronounced pin, or hin as well. Something that's pronounced sun might be pronounced zan. And those are phonetic changes that affect the pronunciation, but sometimes there actually are more pronunciations that are just wildly different. And when people are learning Japanese, you often hear about flashcards. And what a flashcard is, you have a kanji on one side of the card, and on the back you have the different pronunciations that you're trying to learn. And it's not just a one-to-one usually, so it takes a bit of practice to get into that. And I'll get back to that in more detail when we start learning kanji, but right now, first of all, 3 different writing systems, all based on Chinese, but they have been changed to simplify their use, and you've got 2 systems of spelling syllables. So now I keep saying syllables, and that's sort of right, but not always quite. Now, an interesting thing about Japanese is that it has a very limited number of syllables. I'm not sure how many you have in English, but it's quite a high number. But the Japanese system is actually quite simpler. In Japanese, you have 5 vowels. And I think I will leave that for the next episode. I want to sort of section this off a little bit so that we can do it a little bit at a time. So this episode, I think I'll leave it at having talked about the 3 different systems of writing. Before I finish off, there's a little bit of a sort of an extra bonus fact. I did say that Chinese characters were used, the kanji, were originally used to spell words phonetically also in Japanese, even though that system has been mostly abandoned. Now, if you use a Chinese character, a kanji, to write a word phonetically, so not for its meaning, that is called ateji in Japanese. I'll just make room over here. So ateji. This is not a term you will encounter very often, but it is something that happens in a very small number of words in current Japanese. But if you read some older texts, you might encounter it more often, where you get Chinese characters, kanji, used for the sound value only. Right. So I'll leave that for now. Next episode, I'll talk a little bit more about the syllable system of Japanese. So thank you for watching. どうもありがとう。 and I will see you next time with more Japanese. Sayonara. Bye bye.